lunch. Okay, we're going to start our roundtable, and I am just going to introduce our chair, Talitha LeFlouria. Talitha LeFlouria is the Lisa Smith Discovery Associate Professor in African and African American Studies at the University of Virginia here. And I will just say that she's the author of the incredible book, Change in Silence, Black Women and Convict Labor in the New South from UNC Press 2015. And her bio reads that the book has won several awards, an understatement to leave but I will list them because it's quite an accomplishment. So Change in Silence has won the Darlene Kluchin Award from the Organization of American Historians, the Philip Taft Labor History Award from Cornell University, and the Working Class History Association, the Malcolm Bell Jr. and Muriel Barrow Bell Award from the Georgia Historical Society, the Best First Book Prize from the Berkshire Conference on the History of Women, and the Letitia Woods Brown Memorial Prize from the Association of Black Women Historians. We have the chair of the ADWH, Francine Wilson, here. And there's one more. The Ida B. Wells Tribute Award from the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History. So, Talitha, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Sarah, for the generous introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the panelists for the Organizing Freedom Roundtable. Professor Kali Gross, who's unable to be with us today, Sarah will share her remarks, is the Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of History at Rutgers University. Her research concentrates on Black women's experiences in the United States criminal justice system between the late 19th and early 20th century. She is the author of the award-winning book, Colored Amazons, Crime, Violence, and Black Women in the City of Brotherly Love, 1880 to 1910, and Hannah Mary Tabbs and the Disembodied Torso, A Tale of Race, Sex, and Violence in America, winner of the 2017 Hurston Wright Legacy Award for Nonfiction. Dr. Gross's writings frequently explores how historical legacies of race, gender, and justice shape mass incarceration today. Dr. Gross has been featured on C-SPAN's Book TV, NPR, and a number of radio and television programs internationally and domestically. Her short essays and opinion pieces have been featured in BBC News, The Washington Post, The Huffington Post, The Root, Warscapes, Avenue, Truth Out, New Black Man in Exile, The American Prospect, and JED. Lisa Levenstein, Associate Professor of History at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, is the author of A Movement Without Marches, African American Women and the Politics of Poverty in Post-War Philadelphia, which was co-winner of the Kenneth Jackson Book Award from the Urban History Association and received an honorable mention for the Frederick Jackson Turner Award from the Organization of American History. Levenstein writes pieces on women's activism in the post-war United States for both academic and popular audiences. She has held fellowships from the American Association of University Women, the Center for African American Urban Studies and the Economy, the National Humanities Center, and the American Council of Learned Societies. Her current book project is on multiracial U.S. feminism in the 1990s and beyond, which is under contract with Basic Books. Rebecca Kluchin is a professor of history at California State University in Sacramento. She is the author of Fit to be Tied, Sterilization and Reproductive Rights in America, 1950 to 1980, which won the Francis Richardson Keller Sierra Award for Best Monograph from the Western Association of Women Historians. A scholar of women's health and medicine, she has published articles on gender and disability, as well as abortion. Currently, Dr. Kluchin is working on a manuscript titled Pregnancy and Personhood, the Maternal-Fetal Relationship in America, 1850 to the present. And this is a history of efforts to establish fetal personhood in America and the impact of these efforts on pregnant women's decision-making abilities. Justene Hill-Edwards, our final panelist, an associate professor in the Corcoran Department of History at the University of Virginia, is a scholar of African American history, specializing in the history of slavery. She received her doctorate in history from Princeton University in 2015. She also holds an MA in African New World Studies from Florida International University and a BA in Spanish from Swarthmore College. Hill-Edwards was a consortium fellow at the McNeil Center for Early American Studies at the University of Pennsylvania and a Quinn Wharton Teaching Fellow in Princeton University's Writing Center. Her dissertation, entitled Felonious Transactions, The Legal Culture and Business Practices of Slave Economies in South Carolina, 1787 to 1860, was a finalist for the C. Van Woodward Prize from the Southern Historical Association, a finalist for the Shear Dissertation Prize from the Society for Historians on the Early American Republic, and a finalist for the Herman E. Cross Dissertation Prize from the Business History Conference. Her scholarship has been supported by the Program in American Studies at Princeton University, the Center for African American Studies at Princeton University, the Program in International and Regional Studies at Princeton University, and the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Virginia. Let's give them a very warm welcome.
Okay, so I just want to start by saying that Callie really wanted to be here, and as of yesterday, she thought she'd be able to make it. So she has done every single thing that she could to be here. But I'm going to read her comments in the first person. I'm going to read her comments in the first person as she wrote them. Can everyone hear me? Mm-hmm. So, I want to start by thanking the organizers for putting this important event together. To Dr. Tara Hunter, I had sworn off all presentations and travel going forward because of my mother's rapidly declining health. Her battle with congestive heart failure is winding down, and hospitalization is as random as it is frightening. But when I received this invitation several months ago, I said yes without hesitation and prayed that I would be able to make it there because you mean that much to me. You have been a gracious, kind mentor when you really had no reason or responsibility to be. Even though I was never a formal student of yours, you took me on and mentored me and guided me directly, but also indirectly by the example you have set. You are a model sister scholar in every sense. The seriousness, beauty, sensitivity, and integrity in your approach to this work continues to find me in awe of your many gifts. And while I could spend all my time talking about my worship, I am tasked with reflecting upon the ways your powerful scholarly intervention continues to shape my research. So here goes. Introduction. To join my freedom changed the landscape of Black women's history. The breadth of the research itself is a triumph. As it centers Black women's labor and activism therein, Tara also took seriously her mission to tell us about their lives, and it's here where the splendor and genius of this groundbreaking work can best be seen. By telling us about how Black women organized and fought for better wages and greater autonomy, we understood Black women, everyday Black women, as agents of change and also as savvy political actors. Yet we learned even more. Through meticulous research and graceful writing, we learned about Black women who pan-toted food scraps for their family to make up for low wages and to otherwise help make ends meet. We learned about the subterranean nightlife of Decatur Street and tales of Black women drinking and carousing and generally causing a ruckus. I especially love these parts. These sections made me realize that it was possible to study Black women in layered, complex ways, in ways that featured their work, but also in ways that sketched their fights and loud talk, in ways that honored their brightly colored clothes roughly sewn together. Tara taught us how to celebrate their dialectic alongside their deep determination to cleave out a life for themselves. For me, to join my freedom was and remains a stunning achievement, a model, really an aspiration. Tara's study of those Black women allowed me to study imprisoned women. Women who, in many respects, existed on the fringes. Women who stole professionally. Women who lured white men into dark alleyways so they could club them over the head. Women who fought like lions, and even women who murdered. The latter has become my obsession. Hannah Mary Tabbs and the Rushes of Violence. She's transitioning to talk about her second book, her prize-winning book. And this is where Tara's imprint is arguably most visible. In addition to studying a different kind of figure, I've also lately been wrestling with whether Hannah Mary Tabbs' violence has serious and credible political implications. Hear me out. For folks who are not familiar with the case, Hannah Mary Tabbs was a 37-year-old Southern migrant who in Philadelphia in 1887, with an accomplice, murdered and dismembered a former lover, Wakefield Gaines. As the investigation unfolded and Hannah Mary Tabbs became a person of interest, neighbors and relatives came forward with startling claims about her violence and brutality. They didn't just think that she killed Gaines, but also a niece that had gone missing. It was not until police discovered the girl alive and working for a family in New Jersey that they learned otherwise. Still, the account the girl gave authorities only affirmed what others had attested to, as Annie Richardson explained that her aunt had been beating her unmercifully and that she believed that Tabbs would kill her if she did not. Tabbs' violent altercations with Gaines were also harrowing. In addition to frequent fights, death threats, and an alleged failed poisoning attempt, Tabbs had slashed Gaines' face with a razor when she caught him with another woman. During the trial, her sister tearfully testified about that frightening day and described how he came running inside her home with a large cut across his cheek from which blood flowed. Yet despite substantial evidence against her and a compelling motive for his murder, Tabbs was ultimately charged with a lesser offense and received a surprisingly lenient prison sentence, while her accomplice, who she set up in a number of ways, took the fall for murder. Tabbs intrigued me because I had not encountered a Black woman quite like her in history. Though she had much in common with her contemporaries, women like those struggling to make a life in Atlanta in Tara's richly portrayed post-Civil War world. She was a cook and a domestic. She was a wife, and for all intents, a mother too. She very clearly had heretofore forbidden desires that she actively pushed for. But she differed too. Rather than organizing collectively or in a wholesome way for fair pay or greater civil rights, Tabbs corralled with her fists and sought to dominate other Blacks around her. Her violence did not stem from an immediate need for self-defense, and she did not seem overly encumbered by respectability, at least not when it came to her sexual gratification. She had been carrying on an adulterous affair with the victim after all. Rather, her violence was purposeful and calculated. She silenced neighbors and family that jeopardized her affair with the victim. More generally, she assaulted everyone who crossed her, young and old, male and female. Her actions ultimately raised difficult questions for me about the utility of violence. Audre Lorde's timeless warnings about the perils of approaching the master's tools looms large. Yet, Tabbs used violence and other tactics with mastery for her own pursuits. So well, in fact, that I have found myself wondering, is it time to reconsider Black women's relationships to violence? Tabbs' tactics allowed her to effectively cleave out her own kind of fiefdom, and despite that fiefdom's anti-Black and arguably nihilistic traits, I cannot help but wonder whether it credibly challenges the state in the sense that as a Black woman, she used tools meant for her subjection to actualize liberties that the state's construction rests upon her being denied. Moreover, in addition to creating room for herself and her illicit pursuits, Tabbs masterfully used the violence of her positionality as a marginalized Black Southern migrant to take advantage in the courtroom by miming racial subservience. She publicly demurred to white authority and never looked whites or anyone in court directly in the eyes. She weaponized her heavy Southern accent as she yes ma'am and no sir white authorities in a way that satisfied their nostalgia for the bygone days of slavery, the days when many whites felt that blacks knew their place. She cut a stark contrast to her accomplice, George Wilson, a mentally slow, quote, mulatto who could pass for white. He existed as the embodiment of white fears of miscegenation and infiltration via blacks passing. Moreover, he had once worked at a slaughterhouse and had been in the House of Refuge, a facility for juveniles, further cast him as an object of suspicion. The Philadelphia criminal justice system did not regard her as dangerous enough to merit harsher sentence. Tabb served just 16 months. I believe her conduct offers layers of complexity that have the ability to showcase past legacies of gendered racial violence at the same time that it gives voice to the ongoing threats black women faced. It also shows ways that a black woman could use violence as a means to navigate the world and unmake it. I wonder whether Tabb's behavior echoes Fanon when he writes, quote, that this narrow world, strewn with prohibitions, can only be called into question by absolute violence. In the end, Hannah Mary Tabb survived her incarceration at Eastern State Penitentiary, a feat considering that African Americans suffered disproportionately high rates of death there. And she left the facility with $18 she earned working on the inside. Her husband, John Tabbs, died tragically just days before her release in 1889. Still, Hannah Mary Tabbs pressed on and successfully applied for a Civil War widow's pension based on John's honorable service in the colored troops. She moved back to Maryland, where she lived with her brother and his wife in Baltimore for a time, before she eventually remarried. As she informed the Pension Bureau in 1916, she was no longer Hannah A. Tabbs, but now Mrs. Hannah A. Anderson. I cannot say whether the new Mrs. Anderson was in fact happy, but her cold-blooded tactics afforded her a measure of freedom and the ability to pursue a lifestyle few of her black female counterparts enjoyed. Thank you for your kind attention, and thank you, Dr. Tara Hunter, for your pivotal scholarship that shows all sides of us, that shaped a generation of scholars, and that opened up new, and honestly, before your work, unthinkable avenues of inquiry, such as the utility of violence and nihilistic action in black women's history, as well as in the enduring effort to claim and define freedom for ourselves.
Thanks so much to Erica, Sarah, Justene, and Jennifer for organizing this wonderful conference and inviting me to participate. To Molly for helping with my arrangements, and to Tara for writing the book that has brought us here today. It's really an honor to be here with everybody. I'm first going to tell you about how I encountered Tara's work when I was a graduate student, and I'm then going to discuss the influence of her work on a genre of scholarship that it's not typically associated with, which is feminist scholarship on the welfare state. To Joy My Freedom is the first academic book I can remember waiting with bated breath to be published. I entered graduate school in 1995 and read Tara's 1993 article, Domination and Resistance, for a class on race and gender in Southern history. The class was taught by a recent PhD, a Nell Painter student who was excited to teach us all about the new politically progressive cutting-edge work being published in the 90s that was remaking the field. The reading list was extensive, but for those of us interested in women, African Americans, and the working class, there was not yet a lot out there. We read award-winning monograph after monograph, but it was articles by Elsa Barkley Brown and by Tara that spoke to me and enabled me to see what it would really mean to fundamentally reorient Southern history. Tera's article is an account of household workers' struggles in New South Atlanta that established central theoretical foundations of To Join My Freedom. In it, she wrote, quote, "Domination and resistance were always defined in dynamic relationship to each other," end quote. An insight that still structures so much of the work that so many of us produce today. The repressive techniques of employers and state officials shape the lives of domestic workers. And in a constantly evolving cycle, working class Black women's varied practices of resistance influence the forms of domination used against them by state officials and employers. Now, Tera did not single-handedly invent the idea that domination and resistance were dynamically related to each other. Her article begins by quoting James C. Scott, and of course there were others who had made similar points, but no other historian then, or really now, had uncovered the inner mechanisms of domination and resistance so meticulously and with such attention to the role working class Black women played in structuring these relationships. Remember, these were women who most scholars assumed had no power and could never even be studied because there were not any sources about them. So began my journey as a member of Tera's fan club. My professor saw the enthusiasm with which I read the article and assured me that Tera's book would be appearing soon. And so I began to tell all my friends about her. "Have you read Tera Hunter's Domination and Resistance?" I would ask. "There's going to be a book soon, you know." One of my friends was getting her PhD at the University of Michigan under the direction of Elsa Barkley Brown. Turns out, Elsa had suggested that she not only read Tera's article, but also check out Tera's dissertation. My friend only half-jokingly warned me not to dare even consider reading Tera's dissertation. Why? Because it was so amazing and so unlike a typical dissertation written by a history PhD student that if I read it and held it up as a standard for dissertation writing, it would give me writer's block. Because anything you write is not going to begin to approach that level of research and analysis. So this is truly what she told me. Now, I'll admit that I still haven't dared read the dissertation. But as a graduate student, I read every word of To Join My Freedom. I just took a look at my book, and there are annotations on every single page. And rather than go through the book's insights and strengths one by one, I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about how it influenced a group of feminist scholars in the 1990s, of which I was a part, in a way I don't think many people have articulated. And so what I'm doing is telling a different story of the historiography of feminist welfare scholarship that has not been articulated by most historians in the field. A field that when I entered it was dominated by white feminist scholars, but then became more diverse. And in writing this paper, I've gotten a little hot thinking about how Tera's work is critical to this history in ways people in this room likely understand, but has not been more widely acknowledged. So in the 1990s, one of the most vibrant fields of feminist academic scholarship within history and several other disciplines was work on what we call the welfare state. The scholars who worked in this field were motivated by the race, gender, and sexual politics that surrounded us. A backlash against poor Black women who received welfare was in full swing. Even on the left, people were repeating racist and blatantly false stereotypes about welfare queens, and the discourse was stigmatizing and humiliating Black women and legitimating a wholesale government disinvestment in social services for working class people, services that had proved particularly important for African American mothers. Feminist scholars were devastated, and many others, were devastated by President Bill Clinton's plans for what we called welfare deform, and formed an activist group called the Committee of 100 that opposed the plan. Some members of the committee lobbied on Capitol Hill to try to prevent Democrats from passing the legislation. We lost that fight. Welfare reform was passed in 1996, and the consequences were and continue to be devastating for many women and their families. Now, the historians who were engaged in these battles over welfare did what historians do. We looked at the past to help us understand the politics that were surrounding us. And by the time I entered graduate school, people had studied how the U.S. welfare state, as we know it, knew it, had emerged in the first half of the 20th century, and analyzed why so many of its policies and programs did such a lousy job of protecting, even including, those most vulnerable, poor women, minorities, and children. So here's where Tera's work comes in. Many of us who entered graduate school in the mid-1990s wanted to take scholarship in a new direction. We wanted to look not just at the elites who had made policy, but at the recipients of public aid. In particular, the working class black women who received public assistance and had been so horribly stereotyped by the discourse of the welfare queen. And Tera's work served as a critical inspiration. If she could reconstruct poor women's lives and labors in the 19th century, we could most certainly do it in the 20th. Particularly because we could dig up records of the government programs and institutions that they relied on. Tera's creative use of sources served as a guide and also gave us a legitimacy with our advisors who may not have believed that the kinds of research we wanted to pursue was possible. The result was a flourishing of work on the welfare state produced in the late 1990s and 2000s that centered poor black women. And a key component of this work was the insight Tera had given us in domination and resistance, that even the most marginalized women could affect larger social structures. In To Joy My Freedom, Tera wrote about what she called the tumultuous struggle between household workers and their employers. For us, the tumultuous struggle was between women and the state authorities they came into contact with as recipients of public aid. Studies by historians like Rhonda Williams, Pramila Nadesan, Felicia Kornblue, and Annalise Orlek looked at poor women's activism in the welfare rights movements of the 1960s and 1970s. Here were poor, extremely marginalized women demanding, and at times winning, changes in the state. To Joy My Freedom also helps scholars of welfare expand our vision of the institutions that comprise the state. The historians who produced the first wave of studies had focused mainly on two programs, public assistance and Social Security, and they sought to explain why Social Security, which served mainly white men, was so much more generous and less stigmatizing than the welfare programs that targeted women. But Tera had shown that we needed to dig deeper and take our cues not from an academic sense of the structures that were important, but from the daily lives and labors of working class black women. With that in mind, I headed to the archives to piece together their daily efforts in post-war Philadelphia. And I found women engaged in intense struggles, not only in the public assistance offices that welfare scholars had identified, but also in public housing, in courts, as Cheryl will hopefully talk about later, in public schools and public hospitals. Because our focus was on the welfare state, we didn't go so far as Tera to explore leisure and the politics of dance, a chapter of her books that remains unmatched in my opinion, and one that I hope will continue to inspire generations of scholars. But we did expand people's understandings of the government institutions in which political contests between poor women and public officials took place. Inspired by Tera's expansive concept of resistance that went far beyond organized protests, I tried to tease apart the inner workings of those daily struggles between poor women and state authorities. And I found that the collective weight of working class black women's efforts to get resources from welfare offices, public housing, public schools, and the public hospital forced important changes in the policies of these institutions. Now, sometimes these policies helped women, and at other times, the changes were instituted as part of a backlash that served to constrain their abilities to use the programs to meet their needs. But either way, Tera's insight held true. Even the most marginalized women affected changes in the structure of domination that constrained their lives. Finally, I want to talk about labor. Tera's work joined others in calling on historians to expand their understanding of working class people's labors beyond the factory floor. What scholars of the post-war welfare state did was to try to get people to understand that the very process of securing assistance from public housing, courts, welfare offices, schools, and the public hospital was in itself another form of work. Because this work was performed by women who were marginalized and stigmatized, people at the time and scholars even today failed to recognize how these labors sustained families and communities. After I finished graduate school, I had the honor of holding a postdoc at Carnegie Mellon Center for African American Urban Studies and the Economy, where Tera served as assistant director. Not only did she read my dissertation and tell me that I needed to do nothing less than completely restructure it so that it did a better job of foregrounding the stories of working class Black women, and she was totally right, of course, she also became a friend. And I found that many of the central features of her academic work extended to her personal life. Over many delicious meals at the Casbah and at Tera's home, I benefited from learning that she not only had very high standards for scholarship, but also for food and wine. And our conversations over those meals revealed that her brilliant and creative interpretations of history were matched by equally brilliant insights about contemporary politics. The unrivaled intensity that Tera brought to her research, she also brought to watching sports, making it particularly fun to join her in cheering on the Williams sister and the Miami Heat. And most of all, the same respect, affection, and unconditional acceptance that came through in her analysis of the complicated lives of working class women in New South Atlanta, she brings to her extensive network of colleagues and friends. I suspect none of us will ever measure up to Tera's exacting standards for herself and for her research. But she never makes us feel that we need to. Tera accepts and appreciates us all for who we are, with all of our flaws. And that is the greatest gift a person can give to another human being. So thank you, Tera, for to joy my freedom, for your friendship, and for the high, high bar that you set for us all.
So I wanted to extend a thank you again to those who organized this wonderful event and invited me and decided to include me because I had the distinction of being Tera's first student at Carnegie Mellon. So I would like to talk a little bit about her influence. I'm not going to call it a legacy yet because I know you've got a lot more to do. So I want to talk about her influence in that way. And I want to start by showing this postcard. I don't know if you remember giving this to me. I'm guessing you don't. I can't remember exactly if it happened in my second year or my third year as a graduate student, but I came in either for readings or for exam prep, and Tera was in her office. She had a stack of postcards and kind of casually said, "Hey, do you want one?" And I'm like, "Yeah, okay." What I never told you is I came home and I put it on my desk. And I have written my dissertation and a book with it in front of me. And in many ways, it has served to inspire me to continue to be like you, to rise up to the bars that you set. But I struggled when I first put this up because, like so many here, To Joy My Freedom was the book that made me want to be a historian. And I came to history from a career in dance, and I thought I was going to be a dancer until I had a career-ending knee injury my junior year in college, and I thought, oh my goodness, what am I going to do now? And I had a wonderful English teacher who said, well, you're constantly taking these history classes, and you're always bringing history into my English discussions. Why don't you go write a senior thesis? Like, you've got enough credits. Go be a history major to figure it out. And I kind of did, and I wrote the senior thesis on women's bodies, like Susan Bordeaux, 1990s. And I thought, maybe I can do this. I'm going to apply to graduate school, but it was more that I just didn't know what else to do, that I wanted to throw my hat in history. And I started researching universities and graduate programs, and that was when I came across To Joy. And I read the dancing chapter, and it stopped me in my tracks. It is to date my favorite piece of history. It moved me in a way that literature moved me. It put me in the red light districts dancing, and I connected with women with whom I'm very different. You know, I'm a white middle class, I'm a white middle class, I'm still white middle class, but a girl from Chicago in the 90s, and yet I could touch and feel what it meant to be lost in movement and what it meant to work to do that kind of movement. And I thought, well, if I can write like this, yeah, I'm going to be a historian. And I was lucky enough to be accepted to Carnegie Mellon and to work with Tera. But the problem that I ran into is that I don't write like Tera. I wish I could write with her grace and her precision. And in the dancing chapter, I mean, her words take on the rhythm of the music. It's just incredible. And so I sat there staring at this postcard, so frustrated, because I just couldn't do it. So I had to figure out how to find my own voice in a way that was shaped by Tera's, but was distinctively mine. And what I ended up coming to was to approach my subjects in the way that she approaches the women that she studied. And in my mind, I always envisioned Tera walking alongside her subjects. She's not in front of them, leading them. She's not behind them, pushing them, or like observing them as casual. She walks next to them. She puts herself as an equal to them. And that, I think, is what allows her to bring out the humanity in them, humanity that has been so denied. And that's, for me, what made it so powerful. And I thought, okay, I can do some of this. This I can emulate. And so as I went on to write a dissertation and later a book about neo-eugenics and sterilization in the United States, as I was looking at records, and I had an abundance of records for the most part, because post-war 1945 you tend to, I was faced with this issue of how do I create the humanity of the women about whom I'm writing. And I was comparing and contrasting women of color, Mexican-American women, Native American women, African-American women who have been forcibly sterilized post-1945 with white women, working class and middle class, who were desperate to get access to sterilization as a form of contraception. And I was trying to put these trends together and understand the ways in which ideas about reproductive fitness were not only framed by race, class, and gender, but the ways in which that the intersection of these ideas between medicine, society, and the law. And to be able to write about women who have been forcibly sterilized and to say they are not just victims, here's who they are. That was Tera's voice in my head. Do the work, be precise, go back over those sources, figure out who they are. Don't reduce them to a number. Don't reduce them to just being a plaintiff in a loss or to being a victim of an abuse. See who they are, bring them out, and then also be very careful about where you are. When you're writing about women who are different than yourself, figure out your own subjectivity carefully and clearly. So she was all over that project. When I moved to Sacramento, and to the position I'm in now, I took my little postcard with me, and I put it outside my office door. And I did it for two reasons. The first was kind of a, remember where you come from sense. But the other part was that I wanted to, as I was moving in, I was in a tenure track job. It was in U.S. women's history. And I was trying to figure out what it meant to be a professor. And part of being a professor means you're an advisor, it means you're a mentor. And who better to emulate than my own advisor and mentor? And so I kept it out there as a way to say, use her as a model, be the type of mentor that she was to you. And so what I want to offer today is to think about Tera's influence not just in terms of her scholarship, because we know how groundbreaking that was, and that has been celebrated in many other places today. And I certainly could go on and on. But I would also say that much of her influence comes from the students that she's training and the ways in which she has taught us to be the kind and generous scholar that she has, that she's influenced. The first thing she said to me when we met, and we met at a coffee shop because she was on sabbatical when I first got there, and she made time for me, which is pretty incredible because she did not have to. She told me to figure out who my people were going to be in my graduate cohort, to develop a community, to be loyal and true to those people, and to support them throughout, because that was what was going to get me through this process. And then she said, I'll see you in a year. I had things to do. And that was exactly what she should have said. So when I walked into Tera's office, every time I walked into her office, but especially before we got to know each other, she treated me with respect. There was no, you must prove yourself in some way. Lisa, you said something about unconditional acceptance. That's how Tera is. Not that she didn't push me, and I certainly had to prove myself, but it wasn't proving myself to deserve respect. You walk in the door, you're a human being, I give you that respect, you're in this program. Let's start talking, let's start having a conversation. And she had such a positive way of encouraging me, and I know she did this just for all of her other students. And Jennifer and I were laughing about this last night because if you didn't get something quite right, she would take a step back and just give you a look. And I can't mimic her well, and I won't, but she'd say, well, and you just knew you had gotten it wrong. But here's the thing, she never ever said, you're totally off base, you have missed the point. She would say, let's consider it from another perspective. And what a gracious way to do that. I mean, graduate school can be really rough, and when people are constantly telling you you're not there yet, you don't have it, how could you miss the point? There was none of that. It was always this positive encouragement. I never felt smacked down, and in fact, I left all of those readings for exam prep or general readings feeling encouraged and warm and like I was getting somewhere. And when she was reading my dissertation, she edited it with such care. I knew from the way that she'd written in the margins that I had her full attention, and just by the type of comments that she gave me, I understand that what I wrote was worthy of her attention. And that's not something that a lot of advisors get. That's not a given. And because I could see the amount of work that she was doing for others in her network, I mean, every time we would kind of say, well, what are you doing this weekend? What are you doing? She always was reading something for someone, you know? And it wasn't always, well, I'm reading a manuscript for this press. It was, I'm going to look at my friend's conference paper or my friend's chapter. I'm going to be doing this. This was this model of what we did, and I knew how busy she was, and I knew that when she had my work in her hand, she was giving it the same attention. And that is such a wonderful thing to feel. And then as a professor to be able to do to my students too, to say, okay, I give you my attention the same way that she did. You are deserving of this. She lent her insight, but she never pushed her agenda. It was not, my dissertation was my dissertation. My book was my book. And I'm sure there were times when she could see exactly where I needed to go, and I was not figuring it out yet. But she would let me take the months to figure it out. Gentle nudges here, gentle nudges there. It was mine, I owned it. And that was made so clear to me when I got my current job, because the woman who mentored me there was starting her second book. And I remember her saying, it would be so much easier if I had an advisor down the hall who could just put a hand on my head and I could meet with her weekly. And she struggled and struggled and struggled. And when I started my second book, I assumed that would happen. And I certainly have struggled, but I don't feel that I need to go running to Tera's office all the time, which is good because we're across the country from each other. And I don't feel like I constantly have to do it because she let me own my own work. And owning my own work, I was not an extension of her. I was me. And I could be influenced by her and shaped by her, but it gave me this tremendous amount of confidence. And I think that that's something that's very important, to treat young scholars with that kind of respect, to raise them up, but to let them be their own people. And then to really clearly, to be encouraging. And just to give one more story, because I think this really epitomizes the type of advisor she was. When I got the interview for my current job, I was going to have a job talk, and so Tera convened a group of people, and I'm pretty sure it was all women, or almost all women, maybe Scott was there, on a Friday afternoon. And we sat down, and I gave my little spiel, and in her most polite way, she kind of looked back, wow, and politely said, well, that really sucked. And she was right. But here's the thing, I could have felt so smacked down by that. Instead, she led a discussion for the next half an hour about how to make it not suck, right? How to make this work. And I remember running home and rewriting the whole thing that night, practicing and practicing. And by the time I got to that job talk, I was barely nervous. I knew I nailed it as soon as I had it, and I know that sounds arrogant, but I just knew it because Tera had been there. Her voice was in my head, and I could see it, and I actually could talk about it. Because one of the questions in my job talk was, who have been the two scholars that influenced you the most? And I said, Tera Hunter. And it was very easy to talk about why that was. So what I'm going to suggest is that because we're judged so often on the type of scholarship that we produce, we don't think about the types of scholars that we are. We're in a competitive, cutthroat environment a lot of times where we're competing for funding, we're competing for jobs, we're competing for tenure, all kinds of stuff like that. And it's really easy to give nasty reviews and to not support each other. But I think Tera's influence extends quite far in the sense that she's producing scholars who are changing that dynamic, right? And I think the Symposium is just evidence of that, that this is the type you build a community, you work with other people, you support other people. We don't have to do that nastiness. We don't have to create that type of competitiveness. And I think that's absolutely critical. So I thank you for making me, hopefully a solid scholar, we'll go with that, but for making me the kind of advisor and mentor that you were, because as I teach at my university, I teach every other year either the undergraduate writing seminar or the graduate writing seminar, in which I'm providing professional development, and we spend a lot of time giving peer review. How do you give a good peer review, a constructive peer review, not smacking someone down? How do you receive criticism? That there's this whole generation of scholars, even if they're not moving into the academy, that students who are able to have that influence of Tera, and it's just spreading. And I think if that could spread a little bit more within our profession, it might be a little easier to go to work every morning. I'm running out of time, but I will end with my postcard one more time. Because as I started my second manuscript, I actually brought it back into my office, and it now sits on my desk right next to my computer as I write. So I have that reminder to treat my subjects the same way that Tera does, to walk alongside my subjects the way that Tera does. And there have been many times, Tera, when I've had students in my office, the ones who are trying my patience, to look over, take a breath, and go, be kind. Be like Tera. Do not shoot the student down, because there are students that really kind of drive you crazy at times. But I feel like even at that those are the moments when it's so important not to snap and not to be rude and to give them that respect and to try to put yourself alongside of them. So I would probably write every book holding onto this postcard, but I am deeply grateful for all that you have taught me.
So this is, can you hear me? So you were just talking about the idea, the feeling of creating a community. And this symposium definitely feels like that, making connections and kind of extending the reach of Tera's influence. And so it's been such a pleasure to meet everyone here, all the guests and the invited guests. And I know, speaking on behalf of the organizers, that this is kind of the exact feeling that we wanted to have. This intimate conversation, this intimate fellowship, celebrating Tera and her work. And so this is being here and just speaking a little bit about Tera's influence on me in particular. This is exactly the type of feeling that I wanted to cultivate. So, job well. And two, it's been so generative as well, in terms of not just thinking about my work as a scholar, but I think transitioning into this new phase of my career as a mentor, as a professor. I'm so pleased to see my students here too. Extra credit for you, yay. But it is very interesting to be at this point in my career when I can look at Tera and think and remember the conversations we had in grad school, and now the fact that I'm having these conversations with students as well. It's amazing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about To Join My Freedom's influence on my own work, a little bit about my own work in particular, and then a little vignette about the first time that I had a phone call with Tera. So I first read To Join My Freedom as a first semester master's student at Florida International University. I was struck by not only the prose and the topic, but what struck me, what impacted me the most about my first reading of To Join My Freedom was the way in which the richness, the complexity of Black women's lives leapt off the page. I remember reading chapter 8, Dancing and Carousing the Night Away. I think that for many of us is really an influential chapter of the book. And I wondered the first time that I read it, how she managed to display for us the interior lives of postbellum Black women. And this has really stayed with me. The ways in which Tera explores in her work the inner and emotional lives of African American women, how she thinks about and using her sources to examine the texture of Black women's lives. And that's one thing that I'm going to be talking a little bit about more over the next few minutes is this word texture, because rereading To Joy My Freedom, the word that continues to resound in my mind is this word texture. We get the texture of their lives. And so again, that's what I'm really going to be lingering on a little bit here today is the ways in which Tera, as a scholar, as a historian, has made for me the texture of Black people's lives, Black women's lives in particular, and how her approach to writing and thinking about her historical subjects has and continues to be a model for my own scholarship. And she has and continues to model for us how to plumb the sources, to excavate the rich experiences of African American women. So in my own work, I look at the ways in which enslaved people in 18th and 19th century South Carolina made money and purchased goods for themselves. And this is typically what historians call the slaves economy. So when looking at enslaved people and thinking about their lives not only as workers and laborers, but as producers and consumers of their own goods, I often think back to the many conversations that Tera and I had during my time in graduate school at Princeton. She would push me, challenge me, and ultimately build my confidence in the work that I felt like I was trying to do, but was actually doing. The messages that I was trying to convey in my work and looking through a variety of rich archival sources. And most importantly, she helped me to really think critically about how to communicate the experiences of people that I wanted to illuminate. And this brings me again to this idea of texture. And so when I think of texture, I think of the life of an enslaved woman in particular who was one of the subjects of my book manuscript. Her name in the sources is Widow Nancy, but I call her Nancy. Nancy lived as an enslaved woman on a South Carolina plantation called Orange Grove. I first came across Nancy's name not in a plantation's yearly list of enslaved people's taxable values, and not in a work schedule or diary. I happened across Nancy in an account book, specifically the account book that her owner, Samuel Galliard, kept of the transactions between himself and his slaves and the trade that revolved around slaves' independent production of corn. So as of January 1841, interestingly, Nancy sold the most corn to her master of any other enslaved person, with 7 bushels and 13 quarts, the equivalent of over 420 pounds of corn. I could talk about how Galliard, her master, undervalued the price at which he actually purchased Nancy's corn, meaning that Nancy did not receive the full market value for the price of the corn she cultivated during her free time, or time that she could have spent engaged in other activities. So I don't think about that necessarily. I do think about the toll and the toil and the hardship she endured to spend her so-called leisure time tending her own provision garden, how she could have instead kept the corn for herself, cooked it and consumed it for herself, perhaps to feed a child, a partner, or a friend. So in total, Nancy received 62 cents for over 420 pounds of corn that she grew. Had she been able to sell her independently produced corn in a local marketplace, for example, Nancy would have earned at least $3.90. So still not much, but much more than 62 cents. And again, coming back to the idea of texture, what could she have purchased with this extra money? The compensation that her master could have provided, Nancy she could have purchased fabric or shoes, more durable clothing. Perhaps she could have purchased a ticket to go see perhaps family or friends at a neighboring plantation. So at times, enslaved people splurged on items made out of silk and other fine fabrics, and it is possible that Nancy may have used this extra earning to purchase more luxurious items for herself than the ones provided to her by her master. And this leads me again to think about the dance chapter, what she could have done with this more luxurious cloth, clothing that she could have purchased had she gotten full market value for her products. Indeed, she may have even gained a psychic boost from earning more in fair compensation for her labor. So again, Tera's work makes me think about my own and the ways in which she has encouraged me over the years to find the texture, the complexities of enslaved people, particularly enslaved women's lives. Though To Joy centered on Atlanta, after reading the book and rereading it, I realized how expansive the book's analysis really is. That is to say that even though To Joy focused specifically on Atlanta, I still get the sense that the African American women who inhabit the book could have existed, thrived, lived, and worked in any urban center in the postbellum South. And so this really influences the way that I think about my own work. I focus on South Carolina, but I'm hoping that the analysis that I'm doing could be kind of expansive in the way that To Joy is as well. And so I'm going to end by stepping away from the scholarship and talking about Tera. It's funny, I was just speaking to a graduate student here at Gillette, and she mentioned her first conversation with Tera on the phone, and we shared a really fun moment about our first phone conversations. So I remember the first time I spoke with Tera, and I remember it so vividly, so clearly. I was living in Miami at the time. I was in the second year of a master's degree program in African World Studies. And a friend of mine, the historian Leah Wright-Rigueur, suggested that I apply to Princeton, and that if I wanted to study 19th century African American history, that I should consider working with the new arrival, the esteemed historian Tera Hunter. She even recommended that I email Tera directly to have a conversation with her about the prospect of me applying to Princeton to work under her tutelage. At first, I thought, no, I can't directly email Tera Hunter. But after a bit of cajoling on Leah's end, I sat and I wrote an email to Tera asking if we could have a conversation or expressing my general interest in applying to Princeton to work with her. And I recall writing the email and letting it sit and then rereading it and then writing it again, making sure that everything was perfect, that grammatically everything was perfect, because I wanted to make a good first impression. And so she responded, which was crazy, and then we set up a time to call. And again, I remember that moment so clearly. I was driving down Biscayne Boulevard in Miami. I was coming from the mall in Aventura, and I answered her call. And I was so excited that we had scheduled the call. And I remember it was raining, and I was trying to maintain control of the car, but I was so excited that I had to make sure that I didn't swerve. So during the call, we spoke a little bit about the fact that she had recently arrived at Princeton, and we talked about my general research interests, and it was so exciting and nerve-wracking to me because this was one of the first times, really the first time that I was actually speaking to someone whose book I had read and really enjoyed. And so I had this moment of experience, this surreal moment of speaking with Tera and reading her book and really admiring the work that she did. And so we spoke, and I was still driving down Biscayne Boulevard in Miami, and our call ended, and I was teeming with excitement, and it was a very exciting moment for me. And so at that moment, it was 2007, I never thought that, one, I'd get the chance to work with her, two, that I'd be here exactly 10 years later at the University of Virginia as an assistant professor of African American history, celebrating Tera's wonderful accomplishments, and doing so not as a student, but now as a colleague. And it's very exciting, and we've come full circle. And so thank you so much for your mentorship and your tutelage.
working very well. But before I open up the floor for Q&A, I just want to say thank you, Tera, for making working class Black women's lives real, legible, and worthy of understanding. Your intellectual contributions are what paved the way for me to be able to write about less respectable, less familiar working class, incarcerated Black women who, like the women you write about, go unnoticed and unrecognized. And to be completely transparent, I was able to connect with your work on a level that, in a way that resonated with me, not only intellectually, but also personally. My mother's first job was actually as a housekeeper at a hospital, at St. Joseph's Mercy Hospital in Ypsilanti, Michigan. And my father's first job was cleaning buildings for his parents' janitorial company, which they started after migrating from Mississippi to Michigan. They were semi-educated, but they wanted to create an opportunity for their children to be able to work for them, to have access to, I guess, some semblance of generational wealth building, and to be able to liberate their children from having to work for whites and being under the potential, threat of workplace abuses and the like. So your work has been so foundational for so many of us in this room, including myself, and you gave me a vocabulary to express their experiences and the experiences of working class people that inhabit the world that I come from on intellectual terms. So I'm grateful for you and your work and the outside contributions that you've made, not only to the historical profession, but to so many people in this room who adore you on a personal level, but also on an intellectual level. So we just celebrate you, and I just wanted to say that before opening up the floor for question and answer. So does anyone have comments, questions? Okay, so this happens in class. But it never happens in public forum.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you all for such amazing comments. And it's such a rich panel, just the diversity of your topics. So I'm really curious about what you guys think about. There's so much that's happened since my book came out in African American Youth History. All of your work speaks to that, but I'm just curious about where do you see the field going? What would you think? Are there any particular directions, any particular subjects? Or I would just love to hear you guys talk about what's happening in African American Youth History or fiction.
This is not a full answer to the question, but what I'd be really interested in, and actually I think there are people here who maybe could talk more about in terms of how it relates to the comments that question relates to the comments that I made, which is that in a way, my sense is that the carceral state, for the welfare state was kind of this paradigm that many of us were working on in the 90s, and now I think there's the carceral state, right, and thinking about how Black women fit into that structure in so many ways, and I think you can see the roots of that in people in this room's work, that was coming out even in the late 90s or earlier, but that's really, and now what's really interesting to me is that some of the newer work is actually connecting the idea of the carceral state and the welfare state and looking more explicitly at the interactions between them and the relationship between them. And I think that is kind of thinking about it, using language and frameworks that it was there, but it wasn't there to the extent that it is now. So it's like adding a whole new layer. And I think that it would be really interesting to kind of write the historiography now, knowing where we end up, and kind of think about the route that we've taken to get there.
I don't have a Sunday perspective, but I come at it from a history of medicine perspective, and the thing that I kind of politically that has been guiding my work has been to push historians of medicine to look at issues of reproductive justice, to use that lens rather than a lens of reproductive rights. Reproductive rights gets very white, middle class, contraception, abortion, and it's a very narrow framework. And with my first book and then with my current book, I've been pushing very hard to use a reproductive justice framework that doesn't just mean put black women in there. It says, look at this larger understanding of what reproductive politics are, what constitutes reproductive justice. You know, increasingly Black Lives Matter is linking up with reproductive justice because there are these larger notions about it's not just bearing a child when you want, but allowing that child to grow up, right? Personally, I have been very frustrated with historians of medicine on that end, and I love coming to the women's history conferences because I feel like it's far more accepted. History of medicine, as one of my students said, I said, we go up to the MA level, and I sent 2 students to UCSF to begin a PhD program in history of medicine. When I met with one of them for coffee a couple weeks ago, and I said, well, what do you think? And he looked at me very diplomatically, and he said, they're a little slow on this intersectionality thing. Yeah. So, I hope to see the influence, and certainly this is your influence, and also the field's influence. History of medicine is old and it's white, and there's a real push to kind of push that aside, and I think your work in particular guides that. And part of what does that is that, for example, the tuberculosis chapter, it's one chapter in a larger book. It's not a study of tuberculosis that tracks it. It says this is one element of the multi-layered women's lives. And that has pushed, and I've been surprised at how many young scholars have said to me, so Tera does this, or what if it doesn't have, what if my book doesn't have to look this way? It can look this other way. So the interiority that we've been talking about has been coming through. I see it, it's coming, but at least on that side, I found that very frustrating. I'm not going to keep fighting a good fight, but it's a field that's slower, and frustratingly so. But I feel like it needs, and that these kind of conversations and books that might, and works that might be further outside that field are being brought in by young social historians who are saying it doesn't have to look this way. We can recast these frames. We can look at disease and reproductive justice, and I'm looking at reproductive violence in a new way. And I see it, there's it's there, but I wish I were.
So in terms of histories of slavery, I think that there is not just histories of slavery, but I think the connections between histories of slavery and capitalism are really dynamic right now. And there, I think, is an opening for historians to really look at enslaved women's labor in capitalist growth and enterprise, particularly in the 19th century. And African American women's participation in banking and finance. I mean, Jeanette's work, I think, is really on the vanguard of this type of conversation between kind of race, gender, and the burgeoning American financial services institution. And so, I mean, tracking this from the period of slavery to the 20th and 21st century, I think, is where this literature is going and should go, because conversations about the intersections and connections between slavery and capitalism, I think, largely leave gender out of it. And I think that the kind of next step in this process of talking about how, and I'm of the mindset that yes, slavery was capitalist. There are historians who don't believe that, but that's for a different context. But I think that specifically looking at the labor contribution of enslaved women to the kind of explosive growth of the American economy in the first half of the 19th century is really where the field is going. And then into the 20th again, I think Jeanette's work is going to be really wonderful on this, looking at the role of Black women in American banking and American financial services is really important. So I think that has been really on the vanguard of this literature.
I have a question. One, thank you all for such stimulating remarks, and again, let me echo everybody and thank you to organizers for this impressive gathering. It's been interesting to hear you talk about where the field of Black women's history is going. One of the things that's been implied throughout our observations this last roughly day now is the emphatically interdisciplinary character of Tera's work. And so as you think about the new directions in the field, how might those new directions profit from engagement with other disciplines?
So I had a really interesting experience 2 weeks ago. I was at the National Women's Studies Association conference, and this year the organizer of it was Barbara Ransby and Camilla Nadesan. But that marks, I think, maybe a decade at least, in which, I mean, it's a really interesting history one I'm hoping to kind of recover more of that organization. The racial politics of that organization are fascinating and very important because it was a white-dominated organization. There was a significant rupture in the 90s, a walkout in one of the black women walked out of one of the conferences, had to do with the firing of an African-American woman who worked. Anyway, it's a complicated story, which, but the result, though, is that that organization is now a women of color-led organization, and that kind of specifically, that is a priority of that organization. And so Barbara Ransby and Pramila doing this conference is it's like not just the first time it's happened, right? And so it is now, this conference has now become a conference in which my sense from being there is that white women are in the minority, right? So it is primarily women of color at the conference, and I would say at least over 50, would you say, Cheryl, you were there too? Over 50,
I've never been there.
over 50% of the attendees for sure, I would say, at the last conference.
Oh, well,
Maybe,
I don't know about the last, but definitely the numbers look that way.
yeah, right. So that we were there like 75 maybe. I mean, it was so it's a site for interdisciplinary scholarship that I think is really exciting. And this conference, of course, it's organized by Barbara. So it was a revisiting of celebrating the anniversary of the Combahee River Collective and connecting it to Black Lives Matter. Almost every panel had both scholars and activists on it in conversation with each other. Angela Davis was just walking around, talking, sitting in the rows with us. I mean, it was kind of amazing. And so people kind of telling the histories. And so there weren't though as many historians there as I expected. And so I think I would kind of encourage I think that's a space, a very generative, potentially fruitful space for the kind of interdisciplinary conversations that you're suggesting that we need. I think it's harder and harder to have interdisciplinary conversations because it's hard enough to keep up with the work in history, right? I mean, it's hard now that it's like the kind of benefit of the explosion of scholarship is that we have so much scholarship, but it means that even just kind of keeping up with history is really, really hard. And so that's the kind of benefit of a conference is you can go and in a few days kind of get a sense of what's out there in a way that I found really helpful and frankly extremely inspiring. Thank you for that question.
All right, I'm going to wing this a little bit. I would go back to my earlier comments about forming networks, and that was one of the first things that Tera told me is form networks. Find your people, create those feminist, they're at their core, they're feminist networks, so they don't have to just include women. And I think especially as we are finding our own places at universities, within departments at different levels, that one of the things we can do is reach beyond our department. And I think it was made very clear this morning when Tera was talking about her work, about the influence of those conversations with scholars outside the discipline. So to continue to create those networks, those feminist networks at the local level, the university level, with people outside, to really reach out and to try to create those, that can be, it can generate that new type of scholarship. Because I agree, it's very easy to come in and you can barely keep up with the research, you can barely keep up with your department politics and service and grading and everything else, getting your writing done somewhere in there. And then if you have children or anything else, figuring that whole side of your life out, right? But I think sometimes those extensions just beyond the current department can create those larger networks and create conversations, even if it's not at a larger organizational level. That's very important, but we get very insular, and I don't know how all of your department's work, but mine gets kind of defensive, and it starts to come in on itself, and I don't think that helps us at the university level, and it certainly doesn't help us as scholars. So as we try to find our people, reaching out, I think, can advance those fields, if for no other reason than it has those informal conversations. It's the across the kitchen table conversations that I think sometimes lead to real innovation.
I think I'll get your question.
I wanted to thank you all very much, not only for your scholarship, but also the personal stories. It's really nice to hear the ways in which you came to know Dr. Hunter and each other and the launch, which is it's a very small world we live in. I think the unifying theme that Dr. Gross alluded to, but I also see in each of your works and the scholarship you've produced, is the role of violence in African American women's lives. There's just so many people here that I look to and think their work has actually shaped me in ways that Dr. Hunter did, in addition to those individuals, who all look at violence in very critical but also very different ways. Something that has struck me recently was a very small piece that was written by Tera W that is pushing scholars to look at the aftermath of a lynching, not only the act itself, but also the ways in which it shaped communities and also the psyches of African American women. And I think in a lot of ways, I think we should also backpedal as well and look at the lives of these women before they were subjected to violence. Violence in a myriad of categories. And I think something that I'm just questioning, in the vein of Dr. Hunter's question, is what currency does reading violence as the analytical framework of our work, but also not only portraying African American women as the victims, working class African American women, I should be more clear, not only as victims, but also as active agents to contest the violence that they were so often subjected to. In what directions the field perhaps should go.
I just have a brief comment. I think that many of the works that many of the works that we discussed or alluded to talk about, resistance or negotiation, the ways in which these women go about the processes, sort of combating the violence enacted upon them. So I don't know if I necessarily agree that that perspective is not sort of essentialized and that these women are only portrayed as victims and not as active agents who sort of combat, or try to at least, even if they're unsuccessful, to combat the violence that's meted out upon them. So that's just my quick. Does anyone else have a comment?
I can comment quickly. I mean, I would broaden the definition of what violence means to look at reproductive violence now, and that's where I am. I've written about forced sterilization, and my current project, which I didn't talk about here, involves, because of course I have to go back to some more surgery, forced cesarean sections, which I found myself, I kind of backed into it and then couldn't let go of it. But I found a story as I was looking, kind of casting aside for a second book. I found the story of a young woman named Angela Carter, who in 1987, she is 27 years old, she's pregnant, she's married, and she's 25 weeks pregnant, and she had survived cancer twice, her cancer returns. And it returns, and she's told it's in her lungs, and she's got weeks, if not a month, to live. The doctors tell her that you need to, we're gonna give you chemo, we're gonna give you radiation for the next couple weeks, we're gonna get you to 28 weeks gestation, then we're going to do a C-section. But she becomes terminally hypoxic within a couple days, so she's deprived of oxygen. She's in the ICU, she's vented. Her parents come in, they're told, get the priest, give last rites. And then her parents are told, come out to a meeting. And they're at their daughter's deathbed. They go to this meeting of hospital administrators, and it turns out it's a court hearing. The hospital wondered if it had a responsibility to keep her fetus alive. Because what had sparked this, it was very clear, she's 25 weeks pregnant, she's not quite viable, the technology was not there to keep the fetus alive. And the hospital thought it had a responsibility, perhaps, to deliver this baby, because her parents had said, don't operate. Once she dies, leave her alone. Don't leave her body alone. And the hospital administrator had heard of a case a year before, in 1986, of Aisha Maiden, who was a young black woman. She was 19 years old, married. She comes into DC General Hospital, having had her water broke 2 days before. Her labor is not progressing. The white resident is convinced that she needs to do something. Something's got to happen. You need to have a C-section. You're at risk. And she said, I don't need it. My temperature is 99. There's no risk of infection here. this is not what I want to do. Her husband is in complete agreement. The doctor, however, is incredibly persistent, and he brings in an emergency court hearing in the middle of the night. The court takes away custody of the fetus while it's in her body, gives it to a hospital administrator, who then orders an immediate cesarean section. She's delivered at 3:30 in the morning. When she describes it later, she describes the experience as having been raped. It was that type of surgical violence. But there's not much more that she can do. Now, her act of resistance, she had wanted to be a doctor until this point. Her act of resistance is to have her next child with a midwife and to go nowhere near medicine. But what had happened was in this Carter case, the white woman who's literally on death's door, the hospital administrator knew that there was a precedent, and so they call this in. Angela Carter is also forced to undergo a cesarean section. The baby is born, lives for 2 hours. She dies 2 days later, and her death certificate, and I actually have her death certificate in the archives, the secondary cause of death was cesarean section. Now, I read this and I thought, what in the world is going on here? There's an attorney appointed for the fetus, and this is just kind of blowing my mind. So I started researching it, and I found out that a month before Angela Carter died, the New England Journal of Medicine had produced an article, published an article on court-ordered cesarean sections. And that between 1982 and 1987, 21 instances of these emergency hearings had occurred in hospitals. They had occurred almost always in public hospitals. They had an 86% success rate, meaning that 18 of the 21 women who were subjected to these surgeries, or who were subjected to court hearings, had these forcible surgeries. 81% of them were women of color. 24% were non-English speakers. And I thought, this is sterilization abuse all over again, right? What is going on here? And so much of my current project has been to broaden out this definition of reproductive justice, reproductive violence, to understand these surgeries and to understand these power dynamics. And to date, no historian has written about this, but Angela Carter does appear in a lot of political science journals and a lot of popular literature, but it's raised the question for me. I mean, there's literally, remember LA Law, like from back in the 80s? They do a rip from the headlines episode about Angela Carter because her parents sued. And they get in 1990 a precedent that says you can't do this anymore. But that became the story. And the women of color for whom this was happening to more than anybody else, and fitting into this much longer cycle and history of reproductive violence, have been totally written out of the story. I mean, they're not in the popular literature, they're not there. So I would argue if we're talking about reproductive, violence can be reproductive, but I would also say who gets in and who gets out, there's a violence there too. And much of the work that we're doing is to excavate those stories and to bring those to the fore and then make sense of them, not for us, but on the terms of the women involved. And that in and of itself is a new way, at least for me, that's how I'm framing it. And of course, there's my little postcard, which I put away, Tara, in the back of my head, framing this for me in many ways and encouraging me to do that type of work, that patience, showing that patience that she does.
One more question? Okay, I think we have time enough for one more question, so if you've got any burning questions, raise it, otherwise we'll go ahead and take our break. Yeah. Oh, wait, Francille, this is the second time I'm going to give the floor to the Francille. Woodson. Go for it.
This is not going to be a question, but I want to mention two books, and I'm sure there are many more, but two brand new books that speak to, one speaks to some of Lisa's comments, and the other speaks to Rebecca's comments. There is a new book by Keona Irvin, it's University of Kentucky Press, and it's Gateway is in the title. And it's about working class women's activism in St. Louis, both on the shop floor and around welfare rights, and their ideas about the dignity of work and their own need for dignity throughout. And it's very wonderfully researched, the nut workers and all. She's found, these are kind of things that people said there are no sources on this. She really brings out these women's voices, the migration, and she does this wonderful thing about the the activism, the national activism, the St. Louis apparently, and I'm from St. Louis, had the most radical March on Washington movement chapter, and how these working class women really shaped that. And, so it goes from the 30s to the 80s. And so it's a really amazing. And then Deidre Cooper-Owen has a new book on the development.
Medical bondage.
Medical bondage that's about how, gynecology literally was formed on the backs of enslaved women. And so I think that also begins to really talk about this medical and other things. And I also finally want to say that whether you're a historian or whatever you do, if you're concerned about the things we've been talking about, which is why you're here, you'll find a home in the Association of Black Women Historians. AWH.org.
In that regard, as long as people are plugging, you will also find a home for your work as a pre-doctoral fellow and as a postdoctoral fellow no more than 6 years beyond your PhD at the Carnegie Woodson Institute. Deidre Cooper-Owens, whose work was just alluded to, was a former Woodson postdoctoral fellowship. So take advantage, encourage your students. Again, I'll blame you. You started, and you'll find a home. So you'll find a home in the modest quarters. Walk around the precincts, especially go into room 110, where you will actually have a sense of how influential this institute has been in the formation of this field, as well as a range of other fields within the broader orbit of African American, and African diasporic study. The book covers that you see laminated, we don't have enough walls for all of the book covers for books that have been produced under the auspices of the Woodson Institute. So that's it.
All right, well, I think that's a perfect ending to a wonderful panel. Thank you all so much.